Take out a dollar bill, any dollar, look at it closely. That piece of paper in your hand? It's not backed by gold, it's not backed by silver. It's not backed by anything tangible at all, and that wasn't always the case. 50 years ago, a secret meeting in the dead of summer changed everything about the money in your wallet. A decision made by one president over one weekend without consulting Congress, without warning the American people, and certainly without asking your permission. What happened that weekend didn't just reshape the dollar. It reshaped every currency on Earth. It created the inflation you're living through right now. And most people have absolutely no idea it even occurred. The question isn't whether your money is worthless. The question is, how did it become that way, and who made the decision for you? To understand what happened, we need to go back to a time when money actually meant something concrete. When a dollar wasn't just a promise, but a claim on real wealth. For most of human history, money was simple. Gold and silver, you could hold it, weigh it, verify it. Empires rose and fell, but precious metals held their value because they were scarce, durable, and universally desired. But there was a problem with gold and silver. They're heavy, difficult to transport, risky to carry in large quantities. So banks came up with a solution: paper certificates. Instead of carrying gold, you'd carry a piece of paper that represented gold sitting in a vault somewhere. A promise that you could redeem that paper for actual metal whenever you wanted. This system worked beautifully for centuries until it didn't. The first crack appeared during World War I, when countries started printing more paper than they had gold to back it. They needed to fund massive armies, unprecedented industrial warfare, and they did it by breaking the promise their currency represented. But the real earthquake came later. In 1944, as World War II was ending, representatives from 44 nations gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The global financial system had collapsed. Currencies were chaos, countries had defaulted. Trust in money had evaporated. The men who gathered at Bretton Woods had a job: rebuild the entire world's monetary system from scratch. And they made a decision that would echo through the next 8 decades. They created what seemed like an elegant solution. Instead of every currency being backed by gold, which was complicated and led to competitive devaluations, they would create a hierarchy. The US dollar would be backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, and every other currency in the world would be pegged to the dollar. Why the dollar? Because America held over 60% of the world's gold reserves. Because it was the only major industrial power whose infrastructure hadn't been bombed into rubble. Because it could. This system was called the Bretton Woods Agreement, and for a while it seemed to work perfectly. But there was a fatal flaw built into its foundation, a mathematical impossibility that would eventually tear the whole thing apart. And in 1971, that's exactly what happened. The Bretton Woods system was based on a simple promise: any foreign government or central bank could exchange their dollars for gold at any time at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a binding commitment, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. The dollar became as good as gold because it literally was convertible to gold. For everyday Americans, this meant stability. Prices stayed relatively consistent, inflation was modest. Your savings actually maintained their value over time. If you earned $1 in 1950, you could reasonably expect it to buy roughly the same amount of goods in 1960. But the system had a built-in contradiction, one that economists now call the Triffany paradox, named after the economist Robert Triffin, who identified it in 1960. Here's the problem: for the global economy to grow, countries needed more dollars to facilitate trade. The more international commerce expanded, the more dollars had to flow out of the United States and into foreign hands. But the more dollars that existed outside America, the harder it became to maintain the promise that all those dollars could be redeemed for gold. It was like a bank that issues more and more deposit receipts, while the actual gold in the vault stays the same. Eventually, if everyone tries to redeem their receipts at once, the bank fails. Triffin warned Congress in 1960 that this was unsustainable. He predicted the system would collapse within a decade. Almost no one listened. Why? Because the system worked brilliantly for American power. As the world's reserve currency, the US could run trade deficits that would bankrupt any other nation. It could export inflation. It could borrow cheaply. The rest of the world had to hold dollars, which meant they were essentially lending to America at low interest rates. It was too good a deal to give up voluntarily, so America kept printing, and foreign governments kept accumulating dollars. And the gold in Fort Knox stayed exactly where it was, while the claims against it multiplied. Through the 1960s, the contradictions intensified. President Lyndon Johnson launched the Great Society, massively expanding government spending on domestic programs. Simultaneously, America was fighting an increasingly expensive war in Vietnam. Both required enormous amounts of money. The solution: print more dollars. But remember, every dollar was supposed to be backed by gold, and America's gold reserves weren't growing. In fact, they were shrinking. Foreign governments started getting nervous. France, led by President Charles de Gaulle, was particularly suspicious. De Gaulle openly questioned whether America actually had enough gold to honor its commitments. In 1965, he began systematically exchanging France's dollar reserves for physical gold. Other countries watched and started doing the same. The gold flowed out of Fort Knox like water through a cracked dam. From 1959 to 1971, U.S. gold reserves fell from 19,000 tons to less than 8,000 tons. By 1970, the math was undeniable. Foreign governments and central banks held over $50 billion. But America only had about $10 billion worth of gold at the official price. If even a fraction of those dollars came back for redemption, the system would collapse immediately. Economists and Treasury officials knew it. Foreign finance ministers knew it. It was an open secret in international financial circles. The Bretton Woods system was living on borrowed time and borrowed credibility. What no one knew was exactly when the breaking point would come, or how the United States would respond when it did. Then came the summer of 1971. On Friday, August 13, 1971, President Richard Nixon gathered his top economic advisors at Camp David for an emergency meeting. The public wasn't told, Congress wasn't consulted. This was secret crisis management at the highest level. The crisis was simple. The United States was about to run out of gold. Britain had just requested to convert $3 billion into gold. If America honored that request, it would trigger a cascade. Every other country would rush to convert their dollars before the gold ran out. It would be a run on the bank, except the bank was the most powerful nation on earth. Nixon's advisors presented the options. None of them were good. They could honor the gold conversion requests and watch America's gold reserves evaporate within weeks. They could try to get more gold from other countries, but at what price? They could attempt to negotiate a new international agreement, but that would take months or years, and they had days at most. Or they could do something unprecedented. They could simply break the promise, close the gold window, refuse to convert dollars to gold anymore. Unilaterally end the Bretton Woods Agreement that had governed global finance for 27 years. That weekend, Nixon made his decision. On Sunday evening, August 15, 1971, Nixon addressed the nation on television. In an 18-minute speech, buried among other economic policies, he announced what would later be called the Nixon Shock. The United States was temporarily suspending the convertibility of dollars into gold. That word, temporarily, was crucial. Nixon framed it as a short-term measure to prevent speculators from attacking the dollar. But everyone in that room at Camp David knew the truth. This wasn't temporary, this was permanent. The gold standard was dead overnight. The fundamental nature of money changed. For the first time in history, the world's reserve currency wasn't backed by anything physical, it was backed purely by trust. By faith in the US government's ability to maintain the dollar's value through discipline and restraint. How did that work out? The immediate reaction was chaos. Global currency markets shut down for a week because no one knew how to price anything anymore. If the dollar wasn't worth a fixed amount of gold, what was it worth? How should the Japanese yen or German mark be valued against a dollar that was now floating freely? When markets reopened, currencies began to float against each other, rising and falling based on supply and demand rather than fixed government promises. This was supposed to be temporary until a new international agreement could be reached. Negotiations happened. In December 1971, the Smithsonian Agreement attempted to create a new fixed exchange rate system. Nixon called it the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It lasted 14 months before collapsing. By 1973, the world had moved to a system of floating exchange rates. The Bretton Woods era was officially over. We had entered the age of fiat currency. Fiat, from the Latin for let it be done, money backed by nothing but government decree, and then came the inflation. In 1971, you could buy a gallon of gas for 36 cents. A postage stamp cost 8 cents. The median home price was $25,000. The average car cost $3,500. By 1980, less than a decade later, those numbers had more than doubled. Gas was 86 cents per gallon. Homes cost $64,000. Inflation throughout the 1970s averaged over 7% per year, with some years exceeding 13%. The purchasing power of the dollar was evaporating. People who had saved cash their entire lives watched their savings lose half their value in less than a decade. What happened? Without the anchor of gold, without any physical constraint on money creation, governments could print as much currency as they wanted. And they did. The temptation was irresistible. Instead of making hard fiscal choices, raising taxes, or cutting spending, politicians could simply create money out of thin air. The cost would come later in the form of inflation, which is really just a hidden tax on everyone who holds currency. For years after the Nixon Shock, there were attempts to return to some form of gold backing. Conservative economists argued for it. Presidential candidates promised it. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan even created a gold commission to study returning to a gold standard. The commission's conclusion? It wouldn't work. The economy had grown too large, global trade had become too complex, and frankly, governments had become too addicted to the flexibility of fiat currency. Instead, the solution became central bank management. The Federal Reserve, now untethered from gold, would manage the money supply through interest rates and monetary policy. The idea was that smart, disciplined central bankers could provide the restraint that gold once provided. This worked better at some times than others. Fed Chairman Paul Volcker in the early 1980s raised interest rates to nearly 20% to break the back of inflation. It worked, but it caused a severe recession. The unemployment rate hit 10%. The cure was painful. Since then, the pattern has been consistent. When inflation gets too high, the Fed raises interest rates to slow economic growth and cool prices. When the economy slows too much, they lower rates and often increase the money supply to stimulate growth. It's a balancing act, and unlike the gold standard, which was automatic and impersonal, this system depends entirely on the wisdom and political independence of central bankers. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't. Fast forward to today, 50 years after Nixon closed the gold window. Consider what's happened to the money supply. In 1971, there were about $50 billion in circulation. Today, over $21 trillion in the M2 money supply, which includes cash, checking deposits, and easily convertible assets. That's an increase of over 400 times. Meanwhile, US gold reserves have stayed roughly the same, around 8,000 tons. But here's where it gets really interesting. The pattern from 1971 is repeating. During the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve did something that would have been impossible under the gold standard. They created over $3 trillion through quantitative easing, essentially conjuring money into existence to buy government bonds and mortgage securities. Then came 2020, COVID-19 hit. The economy shut down. The government's response? Print money on a scale that dwarfed anything from 2008. In just 2 years, 2020 to 2022, the Fed increased the money supply by over 40%. In 24 months, they created nearly as much money as existed in the entire economy in 2000. The result? The highest inflation in for decades. In 2022, inflation peaked at over 9%. Everything got more expensive: gas, food, housing, cars. Just like the 1970s, but compressed into a shorter time frame. And here's the uncomfortable parallel. Just like in 1971, the government faced a choice between paying now or paying later. They could maintain fiscal discipline, balance budgets, resist the urge to create money. Or they could print, spend, and deal with the inflation later. They chose to print. Just like they did in 1971, just like they always do when the constraints are removed. This is the world Nixon created, a world where money is no longer a store of value, but a political tool, where the purchasing power of your savings is determined not by immutable economic laws, but by the decisions of central bankers and politicians responding to immediate crises. The dollar you hold isn't backed by gold, it's backed by trust. Trust that the government won't print so much that it becomes worthless. Trust that inflation will remain manageable. Trust that the system will hold together for one more day, one more year, one more decade. And for 50 years, that trust has been tested again and again. So what does this history mean for you? First takeaway, your money is constantly losing value by design. Inflation isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. When money is no longer tied to anything scarce, governments will always choose to create more of it rather than make difficult fiscal choices. The dollars you save today will buy less tomorrow. That's not an accident. It's policy. Second takeaway, we're living through an experiment with no historical precedent. Never before has the entire world operated on purely fiat currencies with no commodity backing whatsoever. The Bretton Woods system lasted 27 years. We're now 50 years into the fiat era. No one knows how this ends because it's never been done before at this scale. Third takeaway, the decisions made in moments of crisis echo for decades. Nixon's choice in August 1971 seemed necessary at the time. Maybe it was. But it reshaped the relationship between citizens and money in ways that continue to play out today. The inflation you're experiencing right now, the devaluation of your savings, the constant pressure to invest rather than save, all of this traces back to that weekend at Camp David. The question we should be asking isn't whether the gold standard could return. It probably can't. The question is, what happens next? We've created a system where money can be conjured from nothing, where debts never have to be repaid, but can simply be inflated away, where today's problems are solved by borrowing from tomorrow's prosperity. That only works until it doesn't, and when the breaking point comes, just like it did in August 1971, the decision won't be made through debate or democratic process. It will be made by a small group of people over a single weekend. The only difference is, this time, there's no gold to go back to. If this video changed how you think about money, hit that like button and subscribe. The patterns from history don't just repeat, they accelerate. And understanding what happened in 1971 is crucial to understanding what's coming next. Drop a comment below. Did your parents or grandparents ever talk about the Nixon Shock? Do they remember when prices suddenly started climbing in the 1970s? And if you want to dive deeper into how money actually works and what you can do to protect yourself, check out the video I've linked in the description about inflation hedges and alternative assets. The system changed 50 years ago. It's changing again right now. The question is, will you be ready?